Welcome back, history students, to today's explainer. Okay, let's just dive right in and completely dismantle this whole romanticized knights and castles illusion we often have about early medieval England. Honestly, forget the heroic tales. We are going to look at the brutal, systemic realities of 900 AD. We're talking about a world that fundamentally did not care if you survived. And we're going to analyze the incredible resilience it took just to wake up the next day. So for about 80 to 90% of the population, this was your baseline of existence. You were born a serf. Now, you aren't property like a slave exactly, but you are permanently chained to the land by law. You belong to the estate, the fields, the woods, the pastures. You can't leave. You can't just go sell your labor to the next village over, and if you run, you are hunted down. And the cruelest part? This status is entirely inherited. Your place in this incredibly rigid hierarchy was locked in long before you took your very first breath. To truly understand how this society functioned, we're going to systematically break it down into 4 distinct modules. First, the economics of serfdom. Second, unseen threats and disease. Third, social structure and justice. And finally, the mechanics of survival. Let's start with Module 1, the economics of serfdom, and the agricultural engine that drove it all. If you were a serf, you didn't measure your year in months or seasons. You measured it in back-breaking tasks. Spring meant plowing and sowing. Summer brought endless weeding. Then the absolutely crucial harvest, followed by threshing the grain. And remember, all of this was done with primitive, iron-tipped wooden tools. There are no machines here. Your labor is driven by sheer, brute human endurance. Rain completely soaking your clothes, freezing cold cracking your skin, it didn't matter. The weather could turn bad, but the work literally never stopped. Because farming in 900 AD wasn't just about putting food on your own family's table. It was about fulfilling this totally rigid, one-sided economic contract with your lord. The system demanded you spend several days every single week working the lord's land, and that was totally non-negotiable. You paid rent in the very crops you were struggling to grow yourself. You owed seasonal taxes, and during the harvest you owed extra labor, whether your body could physically handle it or not. Miss an obligation? Severe punishment. There was absolutely no safety net, no appeals court, zero ways to renegotiate the terms of your own survival. And we actually have the physical proof of exactly how much this system extracted from people. When archaeologists dig up skeletons from this era, the bones tell the physical truth of the society. Completely worn-out joints, compressed spines, healed fractures everywhere, and the unmistakable markers of chronic malnutrition. This wasn't heroic labor, guys. This was survival labor that started when you were a kid and permanently deformed your body. A man in his 30s would literally walk like an elderly person today. So, having established that overwhelming physical toll out in the fields, we have to ask, what unseen biological hazards were quietly attacking these people right inside their own homes? That brings us to Module 2, Unseen Threats and Disease, the Invisible Dangers. The staggering irony of 900 AD is how invisible poison affected the different classes. For the peasants, wet years brought a fungus called ergot that grew right on their rye crops. When they baked that into their coarse daily bread, it caused violent muscle seizures, intense burning sensations, terrifying hallucinations, and literal gangrene, where fingers and toes would just turn black and fall off. They usually thought it was madness or God's punishment. But on the flip side, the wealthy were quietly killing themselves with their own refinement. They drank wine out of lead-glazed pottery and used lead pipes. This caused slow brain damage, memory loss, and wild mood changes. Both classes were literally being poisoned by the exact things they relied on every single day. Now, this single number represents the truly horrific reality of childhood back then. Roughly 1 out of every 3 children died before they even reached their 5th birthday. Because beyond poison, everyday life was just a constant biological gamble. Drinking water that came from shallow rivers or wells that were heavily contaminated by human and animal waste, which triggered sudden lethal outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid. Inside their tiny wattle and daub houses, families literally shared their living space with pigs and chickens just to stay warm. And with no chimneys, the toxic smoke from the fire just stayed trapped indoors, absolutely devastating their lungs. Plus, with that kind of extreme overcrowding, if one child caught measles or a respiratory bug, the fever would just burn through the rest of the household, with dehydration taking the youngest incredibly fast. So with all of this going on, overwhelming physical and biological suffering constantly threatening to just break the population. We really have to explore why this society didn't just collapse into absolute rebellion. How do you keep starving, exhausted people in line?
Which leads us straight into Module 3, Social Structure and Justice, Power and Fear.
The short answer is that the church effectively weaponized belief. Now, it absolutely provided comfort, yes, but it also functioned as a profound mechanism of control. It made sure peasants internalized their suffering as divinely ordained. Famine and illness, those were framed as God's will or a divine test. Because of this, questioning the social hierarchy wasn't just illegal, it was a literal sin that risked eternal damnation. And this theology enforced strict boundaries for women too, dictating that their heavily subordinate role, the constant indoor labor, and the massive gamble of childbirth were just natural, unquestionable facts of existence. Justice here is not about evidence, it is about divine judgment. When religious belief totally merges with the legal system, fear becomes obsolete. And this brings us to a terrifying legal philosophy, where actual human investigation was completely replaced by theological tests.
So, if you were accused of a serious crime, guilt wasn't decided by gathering witnesses or evidence. You faced trial by ordeal. You might literally be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar or reach your bare arm into boiling water. A few days later, they'd inspect your wounds. If they were healing cleanly, God had judged you innocent. If they festered and got infected, which, let's be real, they usually did, you were guilty. They'd even throw people into a river as a test. If you drowned, well, God judged you innocent. Basic biological reality was entirely misinterpreted as the direct, undeniable verdict of God.
And ultimately, the law was just another heavy-handed tool for class control. The whole system operated completely unequally. A wealthy lord could just negotiate or pay a fine, but the poor were subjected to brutal, highly visible physical punishments. We're talking stocks in the village square, being branded with hot irons, and literal physical mutilation. They turned the bodies of the poor into terrifying public warnings just to ensure ongoing obedience. Let's move to our final section, Module 4, The Mechanics of Survival, Enduring Cruelty. Because as if the disease, the forced labor, and the incredibly cruel laws weren't enough to deal with, sudden acts of war could instantly erase a community's entire future. War wasn't some rare disaster. It was expected. Totally untrained farmers would just be handed spears and conscripted by their lords, leaving their vital crops to just rot in the fields. And worse still were the sudden raids from the sea. Ships would just appear on the horizon without any warning. Raiders would burn homes, steal the animals, take the people, and leave absolute starvation in their wake. Entire villages could be permanently erased in a single afternoon. So the ultimate takeaway for us as history students is this. Survival in early medieval England wasn't about heroic progress. It wasn't about waiting for life to magically get easier. It was about bending without breaking. Hope was reduced to incredibly small things, right? A harvest that didn't fail, a winter that didn't literally freeze you to death, a child who miraculously woke up without a fever. Honestly, just living past the age of 40 was a massive victory, achieved only by adapting to a world that fundamentally did not care if you lived or died. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider as you reflect on today's explainer. When you look at the grueling labor, that invisible poison hiding in the daily bread, the deadly diseases in the water, and a justice system literally built on burning iron, ask yourself, could you have endured this reality? Really think about the incredible, stubborn resilience of the human beings who woke up and chose every single day not to vanish. Thanks for joining me to uncover history as it was actually lived. See you next time.